Welcome to Divine Intervention, shedding light on Illinois property tax.
Hello and welcome to Divine Intervention, shedding light on Illinois property tax with Nora Devine. Nora has been a property tax attorney in private practice since 2005. She's developed a statewide practice in all jurisdictions in Illinois, and she represents all property classes. I'm your host, Abigail Vaca, and today's episode is Vacancy Relief 101, a lifeline for property owners. Thanks for joining me today, Nora.
Thank you for having me.
I'd love to start by having you talk about what vacancy relief is and why it's such an important tool for property owners facing temporary vacancies.
Well, it would be great if vacancy relief were only used for temporary vacancies, but we've seen that there are some property owners who try to make it more of a perpetual type of a thing, and they file year after year after year for sometimes decades. So this has become as commonplace as you can imagine, and there has even been a legislative response where the legislators are saying, hey, wait a minute, there should be a cap on how long you can obtain vacancy relief, or you should be clearing these hurdles for proving that you're actually trying to bring this property back into productivity. So, you can imagine that the neighbors and the neighborhoods don't enjoy having a lot of vacant storefronts. And so they would like to see all these vacant spaces occupied by some type of a user or business. So vacancy relief is intended to be a break that you give to a property owner when they are experiencing distress or vacancy at their property. And there is a lot of vacancy going on right now, especially since the pandemic, especially for retail, especially for storefronts. And it's a break that's given for 1 year only that takes down the assessed value on the building itself and leaves the land value the same. So this is something that would have to be reapplied for annually because they do want to know that you are trying to bring the property back into productivity. And to that end, every single year they want to know, did you hire a broker? Is the broker professional? What are their efforts? Is there a sign in the window? Is it in a database? Which databases? Have there been showings? Have there been letters of intent? What kind of traction are you getting? What kind of rent are you asking for? What kind of restrictions are there in this building or in this municipality? What are the limitations on your ability to get this space leased up? So now there's a lot of questions that they ask, and it's become more and more and more questions every year since I've been doing this work.
So you mentioned retail, but what other types of properties typically qualify for vacancy relief? And what's the key criteria that property owners have to meet?
Generally, you are not going to qualify for vacancy relief if the property is classified as a residential property. There were previous administrations in Cook County that were willing to give vacancy relief if there was a Class 2 property, which is a residential property that was undergoing significant renovations and it was vacant. This new administration that took office a few terms ago, they have not been as willing to issue any kind of vacancy relief on a residential property. And you may remember the news about how our governor had a renovation of a historic mansion on Astor Street. And under normal circumstances, they would have had a 20% occupancy factor applied to the building, meaning that 80% of the building assessed value would not have been taxed, essentially. And apparently one of the advisors to this taxpayer told them, guess what? If you actually remove the toilets, you will get a 10% occupancy factor instead of a 20% occupancy factor. And so therefore 90% of the building value would not be subject to tax instead of 80%. So I don't think that the taxpayer would have chosen to move forward with that strategy if they would have known what kind of public relations nightmare it was going to be when this was uncovered and discussed. And this was in many, many news cycles for months, if not years, that the governor of our state was basically trying to get the sweetest property tax break ever by this removal of the toilets, which was a false construct and clearly not something they were planning to do anyway, or if it was, it wasn't on that timeline or for that purpose. So now these days, it's extremely impossible, almost impossible to get a vacancy relief on a residential property because they just think if you're going to renovate a residential property, that's just part of the cost of renovation, is that you're going to have property tax liability on the residents that you're renovating. So generally, we're talking about commercial properties, industrial properties, even a big box retailer. They're anticipated to have some 100% vacancy for a couple of years every 10 years or every 12 years, depending on what the market is telling us about those data points. So there is a vacancy allowance in those appraisals that you see for those types of properties. Even the large single user buildings, they still factor in some type of a vacancy when they're valuing those. And as far as the typical vacancy relief, we're talking about a strip center that's half occupied. We're talking about a mall that is 30% vacant. We're talking about an office building. All the office buildings in the loop right now are pushing 25% vacancy at least. And there's a lot more vacancy than that we can't even quantify because people are paying the rent, but they're not using the spaces. So those are the kinds of buildings that you'll see vacancy relief.
I see. So what steps should a property owner take as soon as they realize they may need to apply for vacancy relief?
Well, depending on the jurisdiction, you may need to show 2 years of vacancy data. So let's say we're in tax year 2025 right now, and we will start appealing the 2025 property tax assessments starting in a few months here. The assessing officials may want to see the entire tax year 2024 vacancy numbers, and they may want to see a projected 2025 vacancy affidavit as well. So they want to see that. They want to see a rent roll. They want to see what was the last rent roll before it went vacant. What does the rent roll look like now? And then they want to see what are your efforts to lease. They want to see the contract that you have with the broker. They want to see pictures of signs in the windows. They want to see printouts of all the listings that you have in all the electronic databases. They want to see copies of the letters of intent that prospective tenants perhaps put forward and they didn't end up leasing the space. And they want to see preferably a broker's affidavit itemizing all the different showings that have happened, all the different things that have been in place to try to procure a tenant for the space.
So could you talk a bit about if there are specific deadlines or filing requirements that property owners need to be aware of when seeking vacancy relief?
Yeah, it's good to know which level of appeal will do what thing. Back in the earlier days when I started doing this work, if there was a problematic purchase price, meaning the buyer had paid a lot of money for the property, it was helpful to know that the Board of Review would not give vacancy relief. They would say purchase vacant. That's literally what the notes would say on the file jacket. Purchase vacant, too bad. But in those days, earlier days, the assessor would give vacancy relief under those facts. Okay, even though they paid a lot of money for this property, we're still going to do a 1-year only vacancy relief to give this property owner a chance to get this property back into productivity, get it up and running. Today, that is less likely. The purchase price will control more under the current administration than it would have under previous administrations. So I think that's why it's helpful to consult an attorney, because what used to work sometimes doesn't work anymore, and what never worked before suddenly works now. And so it really helps to consult somebody that is doing a lot of this work year in and year out, cycle after cycle after cycle.
Along those lines, I'm curious, what are the most common reasons vacancy relief applications are denied?
If they're not satisfied that there's truly an effort to lease up the vacant space, it will be denied these days. And sometimes people assemble a bunch of properties on a block and they're just holding that property for as long as they can until the market is higher than it is now, as high as possible. And then they want to redevelop that land. So sometimes they're applying for vacancy relief and they're saying that they're trying to get tenants, but they're really not. They're really just trying to drive down their holding costs while they're hoping for an upswing in the real estate cycle so that they can maximize the return on that property. So when the assessing officials start to think that that's what's going on, you're more likely to get denied.
Got it. So what can property owners do to strengthen their case?
They can genuinely want a tenant. That would be the step one. And then step two is to show how you want a tenant, show how bad you want a tenant, show all the things you're doing to try to get a tenant. And those are the ways to succeed right now in a vacancy appeal.
Okay, so let's pivot a little bit. How do local tax authorities view vacancy relief claims, and are there misconceptions about the process that property owners should be aware of?
The number one misconception is that they're entitled to it. They're not entitled to it. There is no statute, there is no case law that guarantees that people are entitled to this relief. If it's denied, there's basically nowhere for me to go with it. If I go to the Property Tax Appeal Board, they're not going to say, oh, yes, we do vacancy relief because, we see it in this statute somewhere. They don't. They won't see it in some statute somewhere because it's not in there. And vacancy relief, people should remember, doesn't even exist in a lot of states. In Texas, you have a vacant building, so what? They don't give you any vacancy relief. It's really a policy rooted in equity that has been around for many decades and that has faced constraints and limitations at some times, depending on which administration is in power and how the decision makers are viewing it. There are quite a few local politicians who don't like the idea of vacancy relief and have actually proposed legislation in order to curb it because the neighborhoods don't like it. The neighborhoods are like, why are we financially incentivizing this property owner to keep this storefront vacant? So that's where you get the people who understand the multiple layers of public policy that are affecting their neighborhoods. They do start talking about this and they say, hey, we want this occupied. We want services. We want restaurants. We want stores. And so if there's a user who's just trying to keep their property taxes low while they wait out this real estate cycle until they can maximize their return on this land, then that's not a good use of this property in the eyes of the neighborhood that has to walk by it every day.
That makes sense. So what strategies have you found most effective in helping property owners maximize their tax savings through vacancy relief?
I think you're financially better off if you do not have any vacancy at all ever. So I hopefully can advise them about real estate strategies that are more impactful than hoping for vacancy relief. Because if you don't have vacancy, then you don't need vacancy relief. And that is a much stronger place to be financially. If you do have vacancy, then my recommendation is that they are introspective about, are they asking too much for the rent? Are they not offering enough in tenant incentives? Are they not using a professional broker? Is the property not professionally managed? So most of the counseling I do has to do with how can we get you into a place where you don't need vacancy relief. But in terms of if you do need vacancy relief, then yes, I definitely want to be working with a professional broker. I definitely would like to be able to get a 2 or 3 page affidavit from the broker about everything that's going on in order to get this property back into productivity. And if they're not working with a broker, then I have to make do with what I can from the taxpayer themselves.
Those are great examples and suggestions. Thank you again for joining me today, Nora. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on Divine Intervention, Shedding Light on Illinois Property Tax with Nora Devine. To connect with Nora and the team, visit thedivinelawgroup.com. And please like, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite platform.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.